Sir, please start the session.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Very good afternoon. Welcome all of you. On behalf of Center for Applied Linguistics and Translation Studies, University of Hyderabad, India, and Sri Sri University, India, to the seminar that we are organizing online on the theme Translation Across Frontiers. Today, we have a very distinguished speaker, Professor María Luisa Rodríguez Muñoz, and I will very briefly introduce her. Okay. In fact, I did a bit of hands-on translation today, to tell you the truth, because I had to translate many of the Spanish terms to English to prepare a brief introduction to Professor María Luisa Rodríguez Muñoz. I did it, but unfortunately, I'm afraid I couldn't retain the sweet melody and musicality of Spanish language. It's a lovely language, very musical. Even Maria's name is very musical. Okay. However, I am settling for English. I am settling for the English language, as I'm afraid I may not be able to pronounce Spanish expressions and the names of institutions with their beauty and grace. Translation in the context of cross-cultural environments, intersemiotic translation, and objects in translation are exciting areas of translation. And today, we have an erudite scholar of intercultural translation with us, that is María Luisa Rodríguez Muñoz. Professor María Luisa Rodríguez Muñoz is an acting professor at the University of Córdoba, Spain. She has a doctorate degree in languages and cultures at the University of Córdoba. In translation studies, in fact, we generally see a gap between translation studies scholars, that is theoreticians and actual practitioners of translation. But today we have a translation studies scholar as well as who has hands-on experience in translating. Dr. Maria is a Spanish sworn translator and expert in migration law. She also worked for the tourist service of Alhambra of Granada, the press service of the Department of Equality and Social Affairs of the Andalusian Regional Government of Córdoba, the contemporary art exhibitions of Malaga, the Immigration Department of Central Government Office of Malaga, the Director General of Translation EU Commission in Luxembourg, and for International Institution of Systemic Intervention, Bacun in Seville, etc. Before, María Luisa Rodríguez Muñoz has worked at Paul du All-White University, Seville, and presently she is an acting professor at the University of Córdoba. She is a member of research teams Orient's knowledge transfer in the Near East and the Mediterranean Basin. Professor Maria was a resident scholar in several institutions, including Pontifical Catholic University of Peru, Smith College, Northampton, Massachusetts, University of Wolverhampton, etc. She is also collaborating with the research group of computational linguistics and, at KU Leuven. She is a coordinator of the journal Alfinge, Journal of Philosophy, and assistant editor of the journal Panes et. If I translate it to English, it is Panes et, Journal of Medicine, Language and Translation. She has recently co-edited the book Languages, Texts, Translation and Interpreting in Cross-Cultural Environments, New Approaches to Translation and Interpreting. She is currently interested in and working on translation of contemporary art, Latin American literary translation, and translation and gender. I am very, very happy to present a young scholar, Professor María Luisa Rodríguez Muñoz, to you. And now I request Professor Kundu to give a brief introduction to our seminar, because we haven't spoken about our seminar in the earlier session. Today, very briefly, he would talk about it. After that, I would request Professor Maria to present her paper. Thank you. Welcome. Over to Kundu.
Thank you, Professor Shibrama Padikal. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. For those of you who are new to this series of lectures on translation studies across frontiers, let me quickly mention the agenda of this international webinar. This webinar is a humble attempt to enable students of translation studies to comprehend new contexts, issues, ideas, and theories. The webinar is also trying to find out how other disciplines can affect and contribute towards the discipline of translation studies. Our effort is to bring learned scholars and keen students of translation studies together to exchange ideas and to have a meaningful interaction. Today, our eminent speaker, Dr. María Luisa Rodríguez Muñoz, will be speaking on translation as a vehicle of power in the Spanish Contemporary Museum. Over to Professor María Luisa Rodríguez Muñoz.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this presentation, for your invitation. Thank you very much to the Faculty of Arts, Communication and Indic Studies of City University and the Center for Applied Linguistics and Translation Studies of Hyderabad. I don't know if I pronounce it well or not. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Professor Padikal and Professor Kundu for trusting me in this topic that is not so popular now, but I hope after this presentation would be. And my intention today is that after this presentation, all of you at home, in your offices, can have a general idea, at least, of what translation of art means and all the many possibilities that open for us as freelancers, translation studies scholars, or even teachers of translation. So I'm going to try to, I don't know if it works properly. Can you tell me that you can see my PowerPoint? Okay. Now, can you see now?
Yes, you have to, yes.
Yeah, we can see.
Okay,
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So I would like to start with a little experiment. So I would like all of you to think, please, first of all, close your eyes and think about someone that you visit in a museum of contemporary art with. For example, some relative, your grandmother, your grandfather, your couple. Try to visualize this situation. Are you ready? And then for several seconds, I would like to look at slide 1. And then slide 2. What could, in your opinion, attract your companion's interest the most? In front of which could this person stands by for longer? What do you think my students, my Spanish students, answer to me after this little experiment? Let me tell you a personal story. When I studied my master's degree, I work in a contemporary art museum. And during working days, we have a lot of elderly people visiting the museum. And they asked for translations because there were many writings, panels, leaflets that weren't translated. So although there are some people that think translation of our contemporary art or art itself, it's not, it is a fraud, there are some of them that cannot access to the meaning of some of the proposal of the artist. That's why after this experience, I decided to conduct an in-depth researching study on this topic, because I'm absolutely convinced there is power in hand. There is a question of agency in the translation of contemporary art. And I'm going to give you some arguments for that to make you just go in line with me and to be convinced about what I really convinced. Argument number 1. We have lived a process of national museeification in Spain. Our country has become a contemporary art museums country by going from 4 in 1985 to 40 in 2014, which represents a growth of 1.5 museums a year. If you compare this data with those of countries with a greater demographic and economic potential, such as Germany or France, with 10 or 12 museums dedicated exclusively to this type of art, we conclude that the statistics show a very high figure in Spain. Reasons why: the real estate bubble, the desire to invest in the new culture and be proud of that by different regions in Spain. That is to say, having a museum of modern art means autonomy and investment in sophisticated culture. And of course, the Guggenheim effect, Guggenheim in Bilbao, that is linked to local tourist promotion, boosting collective self-esteem, international prestige, etc. So in Spain, museums became essential pieces of the urban landscape of a very important city in Spain. Let's move to argument number 2. This phenomenon involves an artistic and textual flow in which translation is increasingly present, not only because of this remarkable quantitative growth, but also because of the contemporary conception of the museum itself. As we can see in this definition that you have on the slide, far from being an elitist archive, this definition emphasized the social, open, and didactic aspect of the museum, a function of greater weight in institutions with public funding. Moreover, there are some authors such as Álvarez Domínguez and Benjumea Cobano that pointed out the inversion of roles within the current museum, in which the public has a greater role than the object. In the macro context of the cultural industry, the museum has gradually shifted its gaze from the objects to the active subject, from conservation to dissemination, from contemplative silence through extroversion and entertainment. And what about informative material? In fact, these two authors underline the importance of reading supplementary material for the construction of the artistic experience by the museum consumer of the 21st century, in line with its informational and educational purposes. Museums are a privileged place for the construction of experiences the public is consuming when they visit a collection, read leaflets and comments on it, go on guided tour, or listen to recording audio guides, even when they touch the collection if they are allowed to. The democratic vision of the museum is that it's no longer limited to offering art and culture in an intellectual, dense atmosphere. Other authors, such as Selber, Gosdenier, McManus, Fragomeni, Delgado Viguera, and a lot of them, highlight the role of informative text, post-its, labels, leaflets, as an essential communication tool within the modern museum to ensure their interaction, the essential purpose of exhibition for audiences takes place. According to Joselia Neves, not only the content of the exhibition has some semantic charge, but also the way it is organized and presented to the public. This research goes further by considering that the translator who watches over the accessibility of the museum content must not only transfer text, but also work side by side with the curator to open the doors of this institution to a wider group of visitors with different needs and levels of training. Let's pass to argument number 3. On the other hand, it should be noted that the contemporary art itself is characterized by the importance of language within the work, a trend that is emphasized with the birth of conceptual art, in which the idea takes precedence over the object. From the beginning of the time to the 20th century, art reflected an innate propensity to imitation, to the contemplation of reality and its reproduction. Art pieces were instruments for narration and their titles almost univocal. Gradually, artists began to question traditional approaches to aesthetics, according to which art is imitation of nature and art's works are useful as beautiful as true. Thus, the path towards abstract art starts, to personal works in which materials and techniques take on great importance. Artists consider there is not enough to imitate, it is necessary to translate. It is the age of the avant-garde. What is represented is no longer easily recognizable. Titles become the key to access the meanings of the work. Authors are increasingly aware of the suggestive power of text. At this time, the title itself dialogues with the viewer through the text. From the middle of the 20th century to the present day, new tendencies such as kinetic art, minimalism, body, pop, land arts, arte povera, and conceptual art, of course, have been added to these previous ones. In the later, the dematerialization of the work culminates in the so-called art as an idea, in which a strong link is established between language and visual perception. The titles of a large part of the works of conceptual art are one of the many texts that can constitute a representation whose formats vary from the classics such as canvas to the installations and the use of new technologies. In video art, for example, translation goes as far as subtitling and therefore is a fundamental piece in the export of art. For Danto, the mission of a work of art is that the public can decode its content, translate it. Eisenberg and Goldman recognize the aesthetics nature of pieces of art, in which language is included as an expressive form, discarding the traditional conception of the aesthetics that demands pure art, free of linguistic interferences. Experts base the recognition of the artistic nature of new art forms on Dadaism and the weight of the institution in the definition of art by Duchamp and Danto. Even the detractors of contemporary art use precisely the message, the textual argument, to discard certain pieces of their artistic nature. Eisenberg, however, alludes to the purist paradox of denying the aesthetics character of contemporary art pieces in which language is included as a creative form of instrument. Madeleine Dumas is a contemporary South African artist that claims the complex hybrid nature of her art. I can see why many visual artists dislike words in artworks. They feel that words dirty the clear water that has reflected the sky. It disturbs the pleasure of the silent image, the freedom from history, the beauty of nameless form. I want to name our pains. I want to keep our names. I know that neither images nor words can escape the drunkenness and longing caused for the turning word. Words and images drink the same wine. There is no purity to protect. And of course, semiotics has a lot to say about translation of art. The cooperative relationship between word and image leads us to seek interdisciplinary means to interpret their dialogue. Although both signs, the verbal symbol, depends more on the act of interpretation, without which it could not exist due to its artificial nature. The interpretant of the verbal art target audience is possible as long as they know what the text generally means in their language. Hence, the intense relationship between the text and society, and the need to translate not just words, but cultures. On the other hand, it is presumed the desire and intention of the artist to move the audience. Thus, interlingual translation can become essential in the interpretation of art for the internationalization of a conceptual artist. The relation between signifier and meaning is arbitrary, and therefore there is no Esperanto in pieces made by verbal artists. It will require the intervention of the linguistic mediator to increase the communicative spectrum of the works exhibited in public museums. Once the threshold of the Saussure system are overrun, the only way to deal with the translation of art in which word and image are combined is to focus on the linguistic code without removing it from the pictorial as a co-text, assuming that the interpreted art is never finished. Nevertheless, semiotics, although essentially many treatises on the history of art, seems squalid in the light of the challenges posed to the discipline by postmodernist art, the polysemy of meaning, the problematics of authorship, context and resection, the implication of the studies of narrative for the study of images, and even the claim of truth of interpretation. In this slide, I would like to feel powerful, all the translators that are listening to me right now, because many of these problems extend to the decoding of the text of the art pieces, which are to be exhibited in places other than the original language context, since their translation is also immersed in artistic hermeneutics. Therefore, it is clear that beyond the semiotics, the translator needs other disciplines like the aesthetics to realize the importance of his or her work and to carry out it in an effective way. In this sense, the recognition of the cognitive element that was denied to art, as it was considered only suggestive, takes on great relevance. In fact, Kant, the philosopher, described the aesthetic experience as engagement of our mental capacities, perceptual, cognitive, and affective, and the intensity of the resulting experience. Therefore, this intellectual stimulus is present in great art, apart from pleasure, contemplation, or emotion. And all of them depends on translation when the language used is unknown to the viewer. What do we translate when we translate art? And how can we manage to deal with the translation of art as a research topic? Of course, we have to leave our translation studies castle and be open to read quite a lot about museology, multimodality, aesthetics, media studies, paratextuality, visual arts, contemporary art, etc. I started using audiovisual studies to conduct a research and translation of art, but I found similarities and also great differences. One of them is the hegemony of the original authorship. It is the king. And then the polysemy of abstract works, there is no close interpretation. And let's illustrate this aspect with one paper by Professor Vidal Claramonte from the University of Salamanca in Spain, that is entitled Mistranslation Degree Zero, Ideology and Conceptual Art. She said, in 1993, Weiner installed 4 conceptual works on the walls of the Marian Goodman Gallery in New York. Each work consisted of a phrase. Weiner sold each work for $40,000. The fortunate few who bought them could not take the gallery walls home with them, of course, because the work was the language used. So what they took home with them, apart from the language, was a signed certificate which included the words used in the work and the warranty that the work could not be sold to anybody else. The only thing that can explain why somebody should pay $10,000 for each word is that the word was authentic. Can anybody in the room imagine translating a word that has a cost $10,000? Let's remember our fees. If I ask, what do we translate when we translate in art? Of course, the answer would be PARATEXTS, of course, Luisa, PARATEXTS. But is the title part of the work? Is a real PARATEXT, so it is the artistic artwork itself. Bosaidon defines a triple function of the title: linguistic visualization of an object created to be seen, the nature of label or presentation device concomitant to the work, and finally proper name. So therefore, we could consider titles as paratexts and proper names. But the same author stated, on peut aussi s'interroger dans cet ordre d'idées sur la fonction d'éditage des titres et montrer par exemple que certains d'entre eux assurent un véritable caractère linguistique. Ces relations est par conséquent une sorte d'interaction dans laquelle chaque terme de la relation, la peinture d'une part, le titre d'une autre part, sert d'interprétant à l'autre. We have the opera aperta that Derrida offers to the researcher with its concepts that you had on the slides of the parergon. This in-between land is where translation of verbal art is to be placed. Moreover, we can distinguish different types of multimodal relationship in contemporary art museums and hence different powers and implication for translation. So we have to go beyond the so-called constrained translation and moved in line with multimodality. First of all, we can face translation assignment with transmedia works and that imply a relationship of subordination of one of the codes to the other. For example, the museum labels. Secondly, sometimes we can find multimedia works, and in this case, where an image coexists more closely, share the same space, although they are clearly identified. For example, comics. Mixed media works, and then the word and the image have less intrinsic coherence and are slightly separated from each other, for example, in the art collage. And finally, intermediate, in which we recognize the visual and graphic aspect of the word. And what are the challenges that we have to face? The export of art poses the same challenges for us, for freelancer translators, for example, as any form of iconographic translation. Mainly, firstly, limitation of space for text, posters, captions, catalogs, leaflets. And secondly, the harmonization between image and text. The presence of several codes requires coherence between them. For example, how would you translate the title of the work that appears on the screen? That was a translation, a real translation assignment. And the artist asked an English translation of her title, Dando la nota. That is a phrase that means to make yourself noticed, to be the center of attention. The installation consisted of a plastic hand supporting a metallic pentagram and notes. Any translation of the text that overlooked the image will betray the original by distorting the representation. On the other hand, the literal English version of this title could suppress the effect originally intended. This complex situation reflects the interdependence of the two codes. It's really very tricky. This is a trap for us. Thirdly, sometimes what we can find is cultural references. Artists are influenced by their social circumstances, of course. Their works are the product of their vision of the world conditioned by the spatial temporal coordinates in which they work. So their representation and titles are addressed to a certain ideal public. Art translators face the challenge of translated cultures. The original Bangla, that you, of course, understand better than me, is kept then, and an explanation is included in the museum in a panel beside the photographic series. The first half of the title, that means literally mystery box, comes from the legendary Bengali filmmaker Rai's detective novels. In fourth place, we have to deal with the presence of literary resources We could say that this type of constrained modality, the translation of art, is similar to advertising in that it generates slogans whose functions range from being the hardcore of the work to decorating it as one more servile element. We can find onomatopoeias, rhymes, paradoxes, puns, interpolations, adjectivation, and the inclusion of literary intertext. And finally, another tricky element to translate is the narrative potential of the image together with the word. This is the case with the proposal of the Bulgarian artist, Netko Solakov. Some of his works exhibiting in Reina Sofia, Madrid, sing comic books or graphic novels. He explained to us in an email that even though the main story was in English, visitors had sheets with the translation, also of the little text doodle on the walls. And how do we translate contemporary art? In our translation assignment, the interlinguistic transfer in this field can be seen as a complex, communicative, and social act with its own canons and norms in which the translator has to rewrite his or her own piece of art in a sort of balances of forces of which he or she must be aware of before carrying out the work. Therefore, before undertaking it, the nature of the translation assignment should be analyzed because in these cases, the translator does not only translate text, but art. And let's apply this analyzing model to one specific case that in my opinion was a fiasco in relation to the translation policy in the museum. It's the second biennial de Unholy, Lo Desacogedor, that took place in Seville in 2006. The project received public funding. The main objective was to attract the center of the contemporary art sphere to a periphery, to establish a dialogue with the society where it takes place, and of course, to promote the city from a tourist and economic point of view. The 2006 edition also proposed a reflection on armed conflicts, emigration, interculturality, the latent state of war in which we live. These are works that seek to think about the idea of civilization and confrontation. Let us not forget that the venue of the exhibition was set in Seville, and therefore the local language was Spanish. Almost all of the original works were in English or French, and to a lesser extent in Spanish, German, and Polish, regardless of the origin of the participants, of whom more than a quarter came from Asia and Africa. The curator was an African-American citizen of Nigerian origin, and this factor, of course, influenced his selection of artists. As for the language used in the 25 works in which the text becomes part of the art piece, we find English, French, Russian, Romani, Esperanto, Spanish, and Arabic. And despite the fact that many of these works are intended to attack the American system and the exhibition was located in Seville, the language of subtitling was exclusively English. Needless to say, an activity of this nature interested the specialized audience with a high cultural level, but in fact, 10,000 students from primary school visited the exhibition and in guided tour, encouraged by public sponsors, as well as students from art school and adults from care homes. In general, the most widely used translation technique was conservation, except for Thomas Hirsch's work, Re, in which the texts appear in English, French, and Spanish in the exhibition. And then extra-textual comments and doublets in cultural supplements of the general press, and modification or explanation in educational guide for school children. Pure loans and English subtitlings were shocking, even in the case of documentary works with a strong political and humanitarian values, such as La Maya Lloreix, Objects of Words. How can the lay audience, the general public, react to this type of art without understanding a word? Obviously, with indifference, curiosity, or even frustration. In fact, the generalist press echoed dislike and criticized aspects related to the exhibition linguistic policy. This mistake reinforced the vindication from local artists that organized a counter-biennial and anti-biennial performances that denounced the huge amount of money invested in just one event and demanded everyday culture. In translation, we usually distinguish between specialized and non-specialized texts, and we presume a potential recipient. The language of art in this exhibition in the Biennial of Seville went from the universal to the specialized, with striking images that appeal to the collective psyche, combined with texts of high philosophical level. The exclusive use of English as the working language would have made sense if the exhibition limited access to a certain type of audience. By aiming in all directions, from the elite to the entire society, language and translation policy should be adapted and allow for the transformative and performative action of art, providing every citizen with agency. So this is a question of democracy, and it's a question of power. Otherwise, the art exhibit becomes shallow, falling on barren land. And an exhibition entitled The Unholy, in which public funds have been invested, cannot be just an ivory tower. This is why, for the sake of the project's consistency, translation should have been carefully treated, in particular the use of hybrid techniques of translation into the local language. And this in-between path allows specialists to access the work in its pure state directly. Without leaving out the generalist visitor, we will be able to access our verbal or audiovisual art and to enjoy it in all its nuances. The use of modifying and conservative techniques will vary according to these functionalist conditions, with a predominance of the preservation of the source title, in which the only English policy is very present. It's like the lingua franca of the contemporary art. A title that is repeated in the target context can be accompanied by an extratextual comment that helps the general viewer interpret the artwork with all the ingredients that make it up, including the meaning of the text that goes with it or on which it is based. The translator task is more visible in cases where modifying techniques are required. The reasons behind the use of one or another technique may include cultural and ideological aspects, such as the one that we have on the slide, that should not be overlooked by the organizers of public exhibitions, by curators or artists themselves, especially when the raison d'etre of their work is to communicate ideas to the general public or to provoke some special reaction coming from the linguistic message. And let's apply this model of the analysis to the exhibition, another exhibition that was very successful in Seville, Aproximación inicial by Lorraine. On the one hand, we are dealing with a mixed race artist committed to the struggle for the rights of racial minorities, the recognition of hybrid identity and feminism in the 80s. According to her official website, she trained in literature and economics. She was a translator herself and rock critic for prestigious magazines. In her CV, we are told, in her art, the idea tends to come first, and then a medium is employed to be executed, but the work's intellectual content is political, but at the same time, it is characterized by heightened beauty and elegance. From this sentence, it is clear that the concept, in her case, very ideological, prevails in her work, but also the expressive elegance, the style. So this premise must be respected in the transfer to the Seville context of exhibition, which is made up of a little less than 100 works and divided into 8 series in which word and image dialogue in different formats. In 7 of them is quite a lot. All the texts of the exhibition appear in a bilingual version, panels, titles, subtitles, and poems. And this translation policy may be due to the restriction by LEFEVERE of the patrons of the exhibition. On the one hand, the Public Museum CAAC, the Seville CAAC, the Centro de Arte Contemporáneo, that was created in 1990 and with the aim of giving the local community an institution for the research, conservation, and promotion of contemporary art. Secondly, the United States Embassy, that was another collaborator, and the curators, Berta Sihal and Barbara Krulik, that claim themselves in their website We are specialized in providing a rich cultural experience for visitors of all ages, all social, political, and educational backgrounds. It also connects with the intention of the artist. I don't know if it's going to work, but what I want is just to let Lorraine O'Grady express herself. So let's cross fingers.
Tenemos una cita en el Centro Andaluz de Arte Contemporáneo de Andalucía. Durante 4 décadas, Lorraine ha desarrollado su trabajo de las sombras, lo rescata ahora el Centro Andaluz de Arte Contemporáneo, que acoge la primera gran retrospectiva del artista que intenta socavar las bases del arte contemporáneo.
Performance that I did in the parade was a way of saying, not just to the art world, but to the people of Harlem, that avant-garde art is for everyone. That we are art and we can make art. And it was a way of showing both worlds that this is not having our picture in the frame is what is missing from this art world today.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. I don't know if you could have the opportunity of seeing the video. No, it was impossible? Okay, so I'm going to repeat the quotations for the rest of you. What Lorraine said in her video is art. It is a way of saying not only to the people of the art world, but also to the people of Harlem that avant-garde is for everyone, that we are art and that we can make art. As for the exhibition context, the museum and the artist herself connect the topics of the original exhibition with the place of reception, with a new universe of discourse. I think my work is about issues that are deeply embedded in Andalusian culture. I talk about the coming together of different kinds of people. I think Andalusia is one of the premier places in the world where people have come together to create a new culture. This circumstance underlines the need for the translation of the work of an unknown artist into the local language. The maintenance of the titles and the use of subtitles widen the range of the publics to which the show is addressed, setting 2 itineraries of visit while respecting O'Grady's authorship and authenticity, the contemplation of the original work without intervention for the specialist or international public, and the translation into Spanish of Lorraine's works for the general or especially the Spanish-speaking public with no fluency in English. We must add the third one, the reconstruction of the artist's universe and her social criticism aiming at the general public, local or foreign, who can enjoy her work and carry out new semantic connections based on the paratexts located at the beginning of each series. On the bilingual levels and in the press dossier in Spanish, we have to add the advertising paratexts and reports in the written press and on television. The intermediate series, Cutting Out the New York Times, is composed of poems formed from newspaper and displayed on the walls. In this specific case, the reading guide, the one that you have on your right, goes a step further and incorporates the translation of each poem in the room. In the Spanish reprint, on a smaller scale, the translator has rewritten the content. The translation can complete the experience, enjoyed by the visitor, or even become the artistic object if he or she decides to read only the Spanish version. We must also add the material aspect of the composition, the way in which the discourse is shown. The presentation of the Spanish text in the form of a plain text divided into verses, with a map based on rectangle that are marked in black to identify the part of the mural translated, differs from the effect of the original. You can see it in 2 columns now on the slide. Let's not forget that the series highlights the visual and graphic aspect of the words. Apart from the textual codes, an attempt should have been made to reproduce the typography and placement of each fragment of the discourse collage, since Lorraine's style also has sensu apart from cognition. The compilation of paper poems placed in the corners of the rooms for the use of a single visitor every time prevents the enjoyment of the artwork as a whole and interferes with the enjoyment that comes from the fusion of codes to be experienced by the visitor that is not fluent in English. The traditional categories in translation studies that we have, the documentary versus instrumental translation and over cover translation are not enough to describe a text which materially is far from the original, but which at the same time it does not have a merely informative function, but an emotional one. From a post-structuralist viewpoint, this is a reinterpretation of our original work, rewriting. The author has supposed to die in 1967. Should the artist die for the audience to be born? In this regard, we wonder if it could be legitimate to reconstruct the format of the collage in the translation as it happens in other categories of multimodal translation, such as localization, advertising, or literary, graphic novels and comics, and how this new product could influence the experience of the viewer. The answer that I normally receive from curators when I ask the question is no. This is a red line for translators, and I'm crossing it today, thanks to my colleague Alfonso Jimenez's work. But there are some artists that are very aware of the power of translation. I'm going to repeat this terrorist attack by trying to imitate the graphic of the work by Lorenzo Grady. There are some artists, as I already mentioned, that are very much aware of the power of translation and demands the work to be translated. One clear example is Jenny Holzer. I have a short video. I don't know, Professor Kundu, if the problem is that you cannot hear or it cannot be seen.
We can hear, but we can't see right now.
Okay, so it's okay because Jenny Holzer discourse is very clear. So although you cannot see all the texts, you can at least hear how she think translation of art should be made.
Reúnen una amplia gama de planteamientos teóricos, filosóficos y políticos.
I was in my 20s. I was trying to figure out what I believed, and I was trying to understand more about how people might govern when there are so many opinions in the world. What do you do to have society cooperate rather than go to war? That's
nuevas. Son temas referidos a las diferentes guerras, especialmente ha reflexionado sobre la guerra de Irak, Afganistán y también de Siria.
Ella trabaja con el lenguaje, con la palabra como vehículo de expresión, pero plasmada en soportes muy diversos, que se pueden ver a lo largo de la exposición, el papel de sus orígenes, la piedra de sus bancos, los rótulos electrónicos.
I went to text in my work in order to make the content accessible to as many people as possible. I'm a street artist, so I want to give concrete things to people.
Tenemos los tuits para Bilbao.
This particular text started as a fundraiser for the AIDS epidemic. It was meant to be about people who died tragically of AIDS, and it was designed to help fund research and nursing. This absolutely was the first time I used Basque. It was logical once I learned a little more about the history of this town and of the region that I wouldn't just have English or wouldn't only have English and Spanish. It was only right to have Basque. I placed it on the back of the piece, because my understanding is that it was a secret language for a while. I wanted to give it pride of place here, that it occupies the entire back.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. And finally, just to conclude, as you can see, what she underlined is the importance of translating, of accessibility to her arts, and the ideology that is beneath. I will send you the link, Professor Kundu, so you can share with the rest of participants. I think it's a very interesting and illustrative video. Translation of contemporary art as an empowerment tool, as an empowerment vehicle. Why? First of all, there is an important translation market niche in contemporary art museums, especially in Spain now. I don't know the situation in India, but this is the case in Spain. Secondly, the new museums emphasize the importance of the visitor experience and accessibility. Somehow, if you don't understand a language, you are blind to this language. So accessibility is wider than the handicapped people limitations, for example, have. And fourth, in third place, verbal art increases the relevance of translation. We are more visible. In the fourth place, the target story is constructed based on the language policies of the museum, the patron, the curator, the initiator of the translation project. We have a lot of powerful figures that are going to constrain our translation. And of course, the translator also have power in her hands, or in his or her hands. At the moment, we have red lines. Yes, it's something that's, for example, audiovisual translators don't have, because they can use adaptation, for example. But these red lines are based on the authenticity of the original piece, and sometimes it is the artist, him or herself, that demands the translation. And in the sixth place, translating into the local language is an act of democratization. Hybrid techniques prevent both minorized and local languages from being lost in the cultural transfer. If we only use English for everything, there are many people that are not going to access this piece of work. And when translation is invisible, the museum is an inert body that ends up devoured by unique thought that is articulated with only one language. Don't McDonaldized art anymore, as Michael Crony or Paul Bandia would have said. The limits of our work, as well as the techniques used for our transfer, will be in line with the limits of arts, the role of the original, the value of the originality, authenticity, and the guidelines of the exhibition patron and curators. Our discipline, translation studies, therefore, must grow and to ethically account for new forms of transfer in the cultural industry. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope to see you, a lot of you, and many of you, in the Translation Minority Conflicts in Literature Conference.
Thank you, Maria, for your brilliant speech. We have already got a couple of questions. First one from Tanmoy Bhattacharya, and he's asking that the question is about your argument number 2, which is about linguistic art. In his view, such art engages mainly with the visual aspects of language, like graphics, script, typography, and not with what is known as language in the mind at the most. It may engage with ambiguity of words, but that's about it. Perhaps installation art can deal with another aspect, that is sound, but still, as formal linguists, we can say that these are surface aspects of the language. What is your opinion on this?
Yes, it's a double path. One of them is meaning, and the other one is the graphic. If I understood well, from your questions, from your question. Of course, you cannot try to imitate in your translation the art that is proposed by an artist, but there are other means, and we are experiencing, all of us, due to this pandemic, that we are dealing with new technologies for that. So, for example, you are looking at the graphic, the materiality of the text, but at the same time, you can, for example, reconstruct or give the possibility to other people to access by hypertext, for example, to how this text can be delivered in Spanish or in French, or at least use some paratext to explain, okay, this is the graphic shape, but there is a play of words, for example, in this part of the text. And it happens in literatures when you use the notes to explain a part, or a textual part, that is especially difficult to understand because of the connotations. So it's a big problem, a big challenge. Impossible, I think, to transfer the whole meaning. And in art, we have another aspect that we cannot forget, and it is we are not sure, unless we contact the artist. It is alive, of course. We are not sure about the real meaning of the art, and sometimes conceptual artists prefer an opera aperta, an open interpretation that is not unique. And this is so difficult for us as translators, because when we transfer interlinguistically from one language into another, we have to choose. We have to sacrifice one part of the meaning to transfer. So somehow I feel like a terrorist, like cutting off parts that maybe are essential when translating, but it's the only way. We have to assume this responsibility that we have on our shoulders. My answer is a question. I don't know if the person that was asking this question have a better solution, but it's an unresolved case, I think.
Okay, thank you, Maria. The next is from Madhurima Niyogi. She is an assistant professor of English, Tamralipto College, and she is asking that, would you consider Anthony Gaudí's Park Güell that lies beyond the geographical space of a museum as a translatable work of art? If yes, how would it be translated?
Which is a work?
Anthony Gaudí, G-A-U-D-I, Park Güell.
Okay, I am going to Google it now. Anthony, can you describe how it is, so we can brush up a little bit in my answer? Anthony Goodman.
G-A-U-D-I, then Park Güell, P-A-R-K, Park Güell, G-U-E-L-L.
Park Güell. Can access now. Oh, can this person explain to me exactly how it is, how the artistic object is?
Rindam, unmute her and let her speak.
Just a second, sir.
The question.
Yeah, so send me a little image of a link of this artist.
Yeah, I have tried. Just a second.
Yes, thank you.
Hello.
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 Yeah, Madhurima, you're very much audible.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
So I was actually talking about Gaudí's Park Güell. Gaudí, the same Gaudí of the La Sagrada Familia fame. And it is basically public park network with certain housing societies built into it. There was supposed to be a kind of a marketplace with residences on both sides, and it was designed by Anton Gaudi, and it has his trademark style, but the same which we can see in Casa Batlló and obviously in La Sagrada as well. So it is an architectural work, and it is incomplete as far as I know, since it could, for certain reasons, financial and otherwise, it could not be completed. And it does experience a lot of tourist viewers every year. And what I was wondering, that is this architectural work, which is so immense in its size, if it is to be considered as a translatable object, how we can proceed with the endeavor?
Oh my God, it's so difficult. I'm sweating now. I'm asking you, do you have any idea about doing that? Because in my opinion, it's kind of untranslatable.
Well, from what I could make out, you spoke about restoration. One needs to restore certain pieces of work as well. And Park Güell does experience restoration from time to time. But the issue of translation becomes relevant because we have people speaking so many languages visiting Park Güell every year. And they are just going to the place like one would to, say, London's Hyde Park, and they are roaming around the place. And I would be very surprised if all of them got a very clear notion or a clear idea of what they are witnessing. They are paying for it, but they are not really getting a lot of comprehension out of it. So that is why it's a question for me as well, that apart from the restoration aspect which you spoke about, how else can such an immense work be rendered translatable and thus more communicable, more accessible for a greater audience, so to speak?
Yeah, yes. And you can use labels, you can use leaflets, and you can use graffiti, but I don't think this is legal.
No, graffiti is definitely not legal at that place.
Okay, yes, and I don't know how the texts are presented, the way they are presented in labels, or do they use panels?
Texts are not presented. That is my point, you see. They're neither in Catalan nor in Spanish do you have the texts. So the texts are not present.
I think that there is another question that we don't have to forget, and I didn't add in my presentation. It is the cryptic, mysterious aspect that we are attracted to, and this is something that sometimes we forget. And maybe this is the ingredient that make people to visit this place without asking for the meaning, or they don't have any idea about the meaning. Different, what I did in my projects, not so difficult like the one that you are presenting now, because I deal with plastic art, no architecture. But what I do is I'm using labels, I'm using leaflets, I'm using maps, hypertext, and either I don't know if they can virtually reconstruct this neighborhood virtually with linguistically speaking, but it's quite difficult.
Thank you for taking my question, and I do wish they would take your suggestions into consideration, the ones who are the authority there.
Yeah, thank you very much, because it can be one of my objects of a study for the future.
You're most welcome.
Thank you for the idea.
Thanks.
Thank you, Madhurima. The next question is that how are you making distinction between the various mediums of art expression compared to the verbal expressions? Can you please elaborate a bit more on translation in context with art expression and art experience?
Art expression and art experience. Can you repeat the whole question? Because
Yeah.
the first
Okay.
part was wasn't very clear for me. Sorry.
Okay. How are you making distinction between
Yes.
the various mediums of art expression compared to the verbal expressions? Can you please elaborate a bit more on the translation in context with art expression and art experience?
Art expression and art experience. Yes, differences between art expression, art experience. Art expression in my presentation meant techniques used, such as sculpture, canvas, technological devices, installations, etc. And the experience is something subjective. It's a way that you see, feel in front of this installation, this artistic object. So what I meant in my presentation is translating one work. It's very powerful and ethically charged because we are intruders in the viewers and the audience experience somehow. So for sure, if you try to conduct an empirical study with different audiences that can look at the installation, for example, directly with or without translation, the aesthetic experience is going to be quite different. I don't know if you have the feeling when visiting a contemporary art museum that there are some people that are very focused on text instead of the piece of art. So instead of contemplation, we are a society of reading a lot. And there are people that are taking photographs of the label instead of the piece of art, because we want to know what it means. We need answers to our questions. So I don't know if this is what the participant wanted to know from me, but the difference in my presentation was that an artistic expression that is classifying different categories depending on the materials and techniques used, and then the experience that is subjective, and it is the feeling, the emotion, the cognition activity that is triggered by the contemplation of our installation, of the understanding of an installation. Sometimes it's all together. It's very it's complicated to separate and slice in different pieces, because it's like it's a sign network, and everything is intertwined.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. The next question.
Maria, I have I just thank you, Maria, for that very fascinating lecture. Because while listening to you, as I mentioned to you before the before the meeting when we were chatting, that your presentation actually very strongly actually reminded me of Barry Flirt's book, Objects in Translation, where he actually it proposes an approach to entanglements of medieval elites in present day Pakistan and Afghanistan, where he actually presents the representation or representations or translations of, or he looks at coins, dress, monuments, paintings, sculptures, and how they mediated diverse modes of encounter. How can we actually construe the diverse modes of encounter through coins, dress, and various other things? And your lecture was really wonderful, and I was quite reminded of that book. And I don't have a question, but I want to thank you on behalf of Carl's and Department of Arts, Communication and Indic Studies, Sri University. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to you. I feel honored to receive this answer. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Professor. The last question that I got right now, that do you think that the translation of the visual text, visual art, translation in the visual art domain, and the translation as we do understand in the linguistic domain, do you think that they are different? If it is so, can you explain with with examples?
Visual art and linguistic art.
No,
Okay.
visual art and linguistic text. Translation as visual in the domain of visual art, and translation in as we do understand, transference of meaning from one text to the other. So how they are different from each other?
Okay, I'm not a specialist in visual art. I use it to integrate it, of course, because I need it in my art, contemporary art translation studies. But from what I read, in the visual arts, we have multimodality, all the different codes that interact. So we cannot translate without double checking before and being absolutely sure how all these little pieces connect one each other. And in the textual interlingual, proper translation, we are very free somehow, because we don't have this servitude constraint that the visual codes put on us. But I have to say that although it sounds problematic, visual arts is challenging and joyful. So at the same time, it's something that makes you feel like you are doing something super complicated, and it's more motivating from my viewpoint. But the main difference is that you have a semiotic network, much complex in the visual arts. And what I found super difficult when I contacted curators and art specialists is to make them understand the importance of translation and how I see and how I contemplate, how I experience as a translator and a piece of art, because it's quite different. I see text and I am looking for meanings, and for them it's like for you, for example, in India, it's like a sacred cow. Please don't touch my work, don't translate it, don't dirty my work. And I explain to them, okay, if you want to be an anti-system or a person that is super controversial, that want to change the society, you cannot do it on your own or with your very rich, intellectually dense, avant-garde colleagues. It makes no sense. You need to move other people, and to do that, you have to translate somehow. And it's not a humiliation, but I normally receive this kind of answer. Please don't touch that. This is a red line. And when something is prohibited, it makes you feel desire more. And this is what happened to me. I'm always touching the artworks. So we are more free in the textual translation without any interference from the visual, but I think it's more motivating the other one. And you have to take into account that you have to do a research work that is much harder, and to contact a curator, artist, administrative staff. You have to go to the exhibition, for example, to know how your text is going to be exhibited, what they are looking for, what kind of audience is going to receive this text, because somehow this is a communicative relationship between text and images. So it have to work by communicating and by looking for information and to be ready to translate or not translate, because sometimes when you spend, I don't know, 1 day, 2 days looking for information, you decide not to translate, zero translation. And this is another way to translate, because when you change the way or the place where an artwork is placed to another, you are translating, because the consequences, the connotations are different. The impact is different for a different target culture audience.
And that actually, Maria, actually tempts me to ask one more question to you about your personal experience, because you are working on this visual translation and you are interested in visual art, etc. You are conducting a seminar on, translation and minorities. At the same time, you are also a member of an organization that which deals with philology. Then you are also involved in doing work in computational linguistics. So do you think the very basic assumptions about the language, about the text, about translation, in these two different domains are contradictory, or they are, in a way opposing, each other, etc. And how do you deal with this, one which actually, philology, computational linguistics, etc., which believes in, believes in an inherent meaning of language, etc., truth in language, etc. And the other which actually talks about translation only in terms of representation, rewriting. And how do you deal with in this in our work in these both domains? What is your experience?
My experience, I'm going to answer in a very personal way. In my opinion, we have prejudice as linguistics, linguistic experts and translators. We see the world in a biased way, and visual artists too. So we have to be aware of our bias first. We have to be aware of the artificial differences established in the academia between different disciplines, such as linguistic literature, translation studies. It's like a Freud conflict, the one that we have. We are more interconnected. And so, yes, I think it's more operative to work in parts separately, but after a process of maturing, we have to go and reunite at the end. So I try to do it in a very integral work, and I fight very hard with myself, trying to not to be so much translator when I'm facing this kind of works, because my tendency, my natural tendency for inertia is just to focus on the language. So I have to just contain, to apply self-control, and to try to be as free as I was when I was a child, and to face new forms of communication, as Steiner said, translation in vertical and horizontal ways. And we live, we communicate, we are translating all the ways. In different experiences, we need translation to survive. So I try to remember this like a slogan put on my computer every time I face this time, this kind of assignments. But it's complicated because we are biased. We are biased because of our training, because from the very first year at the university, they repeat it to us. You are a translator, you are not a linguist, you are not an artist. And at the end, you discover after your training that the world is more complicated than that. And you have again to reconstruct what has been shattered during your training. And that's how I think this is kind of art therapy, what I use for my day-to-day life.
Thank you, Maria, for this brilliant expression. So we come to an end of this session, and we have seen the drawing on theoretical frameworks from a range of academic fields: translation studies, museum studies, art history, media studies, and on methodological models based on multimodality, systematic functional linguistics, and audiovisual translation. This special talk by Maria Rodriguez has tried to open up a collaborative and supportive space for the understanding of how and to what extent translation as an instrument of accessibility for all can mobilize and control cultural, cognitive, linguistic, and political experiences. With that note, I'm ending today's session. I'm sure that you all will join in the next session on 11th. I'll send a mail to all of you. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks to you. Stay safe and see you in the next webinar. And thank you very much for this incredible experience that you are organizing.
And I really thank to Maria Rodriguez for accepting our invitation. I thank Professor Parikal for being there. I thank all the participants, especially Madhurima, for her brilliant question. And I also thank all my students, my colleagues in the department, and the IT department of the Sri Sri University for this conduction of the webinar. Thank you. Thank you all. Stay safe.
See you.
Bye. Bye.